let's review unit rate and how to use unit rate to find other rates. Let's say I was given a ratio and told that I could purchase 8 books for $120. So my ratio is 8 to 120. What if I then asked the price of 13 books? How am I going to use 8 books in order to find 13? The problem is 13 is not a multiple of 8. If I skip count by 8, I go 8, 16, 24. I skip right over 13. So I can't use an equivalent ratio in order to get from 8 to 13. I'm instead going to have to use a unit rate. A unit rate would be finding the price of one book. Because if I can find the price of one book, I can use that to find the price of 13. How do I find a unit rate? First, we need to ask ourselves what we do to the 8 in order to get from an 8 to a 1. Since this number is getting smaller, I know I'm going to use division. And I should know my math facts well enough to know that any number divided by itself is 1. So in order to get from 8 books to 1 book, I need to divide 8 by 8. Now remember that with ratios, whatever I do to one side of my ratio, I have to do the same thing to the other, which means that I will have to take 120 and divide that by 8. When I divide 120 by 8, I find that one book cost $15. How does this help me answer my question? I was trying to find the price of 13 books, not one. Well, the good news is if I know the price of one book, I should be able to find the price of 13 books. I can get from 1 to 13 by multiplying 1 times 13. And this is why a unit rate is so useful. We can find any amount using a 1 simply by multiplying that number by 1. And again, with a ratio, whatever I do to one side, I do the same thing to the other side. So if I'm trying to figure out the price of 13 books, I'm going to take the price of one book, which is $15, and multiply it by 13. This will tell me the price or the cost of purchasing 15 books. And since 15 times 13 is 195, I know that 13 books cost $195. This is how I can use a unit rate to find any rate. The first thing I need to do is take my original amount of my item and find out how much it would be for one. We do this by dividing that number by itself. Then I multiply my unit rate by whatever number or amount of the object I'm looking for. If I do this to both numbers in my ratio, I should get my answer. How does this relate to percents? Let's say that I go to purchase 13 books for $195, but I have a coupon that says I can get 40% off of my purchase. How do I figure out how much money I'm actually spending on books? There are two different ways that we can do this. The first is to use benchmark percents, and the second is to use a unit rate. Let's take a look. I know that $195 is my total, so that's 100%. I want to find 40%, but 40 is not a multiple of 100. There is nothing I can divide 100 by to get a 40. So in order to figure this out, I'm going to have to either use a benchmark percent or use 1%. My benchmark percents are 10%, 25%, and 50%. When I look at these benchmarks, I can see that I can easily use a 10% in order to get a 40%. If I know what 10% is, I can find 40. How do I find 10% of 195? Well, I know that percents work just like ratios. So to go from 100 to 10, I simply divide by 10 because 10 times 10 is 100. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do the same thing to the other. If I divide 195 by 10, I'm going to end up with $19.50. This is 10% of my total price. Now I should be able to go from 10 to 40. 10 times 4 is 40, which means in order to figure out 40%, I simply need to multiply 19 and 5/10 by 40. When I do this, I find that $78 is 40% of $195. This is not my answer, though. Remember, my coupon said I'm taking 40% off of my original price. So in order to figure out how much money I'm actually spending on books, I need to take 40% off of $195 through subtraction. So I'm going to minus 195 minus 78 in order to figure out how much money I actually spent on books. When I do this, I find that I'm only spending $117 on books, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's a lot better than spending $195. This is one way I can go about finding percents, by using one of my benchmarks. The other way is by using a unit rate, just like we did in our previous problem. If I know that 195 is 100%, and let's say I'm trying to find 23%. The easiest way to go from 100% to 23% is to use a unit rate. None of my benchmarks are going to easily get me to 23. 10 could get me to 20, but not 23. 25 skips right over 23, so does 50. So the easiest thing to do here is use a unit rate. Now remember, any number divided by itself is 1, so 100 divided by 100 is going to get me 1%. If I do the same thing to the other side of my ratio, if I divide 195 by 100, I'm going to be left with 1 and 95/100ths. All I need to do from here is multiply my unit rate by the number I'm trying to find. I'm trying to find 23. So 1% times 23 is 23%, and 1 and 95/100ths times 23 is going to get me an answer of 44 and 85/100ths. So depending on what percent you're trying to get to, it may be easier to use a unit rate or a benchmark percent. But either way, we can use our same ratio strategies in order to reason about percents.